This scene starts off with Lady Macbeth. She has already rang the bell to cue her husband in for the killing. The king's men are asleep, and all that is left is for Duncan to be murdered. She is almost excited at the thought of Duncan dying. But at that moment, she hears a voice cry out. The thought that her husband might have failed in the task of killing the king worries her. She thinks to herself that she would have murdered King Duncan, but the sight of Duncan sleeping reminded her of her very own father, so she couldn't manage to commit the act herself. At this point, Macbeth enters the room with a bloody dagger and says,
"I've done the deed. Didst thou not hear noise?"
It turns out to be the case that Lady Macbeth was not the only one to hear the voice cry out. Macbeth had heard it too, and it frightened him more than just a little. He then goes on to tell his wife that he heard a servant laugh in his sleep as another one cried out, "Murder!" Apparently, according to Macbeth at least, the two servants woke each other up and then went back to sleep. At this point, we can't help but wonder if Macbeth is hallucinating again, as he was hallucinating when he saw the floating dagger in Act 2, Scene 1. The story becomes even more bizarre when Macbeth says that one of the servants cried out, "God bless us!" and the other replied, "Amen." Macbeth emphasizes over and over again that he could not reply amen to what these servants were saying. And when Lady Macbeth tells him not to consider these matters so deeply, Macbeth continues to be glued to the idea of not being able to say amen at that very moment. While Lady Macbeth continues to tell her husband to stop thinking about these things and just calm down, Macbeth continues to press on about hearing random voices that apparently cried out things like, "Sleep no more, Macbeth is murdering sleep." But Lady Macbeth's support for her husband turns into sheer disappointment and almost belittling disgust as she realizes that the bloody dagger, which was supposed to be left with the sleeping guards in order to frame them, was carried all the way into their room. It's obvious that the dagger needs to be placed near the guards, but Macbeth is clearly shaken at this point. He says,
"I'll go no more. I am afraid to think what I've done. Look on it again, I dare not."
Scolding her husband, Lady Macbeth takes the dagger and decides to deal with matters herself. She tells her husband that the dead and the sleeping are no different than just pictures, which is clearly different from how she was feeling earlier on when she was confessing to herself that she couldn't manage to kill the king because he looked like her father. Clearly, the dead and the sleeping are at least a little bit more than just pictures, not just to Macbeth, but also to Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth leaves in order to frame the sleeping men, and from the distance, a loud knocking noise starts to scare Macbeth. Macbeth becomes intensely frightened and once again starts to hallucinate as he stares at his hand and says,
"What hands are here? Ah! They pluck out mine eyes!"
But his rambling about random illusions gets interrupted by Lady Macbeth's arrival again. Her hands are all bloody, and she says,
"My hands are of your color, but I shame to hear a heart so white."
As the knocking seems to continue, Lady Macbeth says that she thinks she heard someone from the south entrance knocking at the gate. And regarding the blood on her hands, she figures that little water cleanses this deed, and orders her husband to put on his nightgown and go back to bed. But will it actually be as simple as that? Will a little water actually clear them of their deeds? This is something that we will soon find out. The scene ends with regret as expressed by Macbeth.
"Oh, to know my deed, 'twere best not to know myself. Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst."